I won't. Um, so what I wanted to do today is talk a little bit about the story in Duskers, which I haven't really talked a lot about, and I haven't wanted to talk a lot about because I figured, even though the game is procedural and there's all sorts of cool stuff around that, um, I never want to give anything away because I feel like it's kind of like when I did early, not there wasn't early access with a virus named Tom, but when I let people into a virus named Tom, I kept adding levels and the story to the game, and that was cool because that left something to be desired. So I've been kind of avoiding talking about story. However, it's kind of silly because the story changes so much over time that if I talk about story, at the end, it's not going to spoil anything because not only do we have to flesh it all out, but it'll probably be completely different than whatever I started with. So I thought it might be fun to look at the way that the story has evolved so far and some of the cool things that we're thinking about. I don't know. I thought you guys might get a kick out of that because it's always fun for me to talk about science fiction and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, so let's get started. I want to go way back, way back, and talk about way back when this was. Hold on, can I do this? Monitor capture. Way back when the game, and this is not Duskers, this is just The Gathering. But way back in the day, there was an article written about Duskers at the very beginning when it was just a concept called Scavenger. Um, and one of the fun things about that was that the story was so completely different. One of the main things about the story back then was basically there wasn't a what would you call it? There wasn't. I didn't really have a grasp on the gameplay mechanics. So back in the day, the game was the story that I had in mind was this. I was in love with the idea of gritty old tech and tech breaking down, and that was one of the kind of staples of the game that I really loved. And so the thing that conjured in my mind the most was the Millennium Falcon, because I felt like whenever I watched Star Wars and like Chewie and Han are like trying to scrap something together, and they're right about to die, and then they fix the warp drive, and then they shoot off into space, and I always thought that was cool, because everything I had experienced up until then was these images from Popular Mechanics or something like that of this super sexy, sleek future where everything just worked really well. And I looked out at the roads and I would see these broken down Winnebagos or these older cars. And then when I saw the X wings and the Y wings that were so kind of ugly, and the rebellion was just sort of piecing things together, that was really cool for me. So I started off with this notion that why would you be piloting drones into derelict spaceships? And my thought is that hey, you're basically a Tomb Raider. You're kind of trying to rob them of something, and I came up with this storyline where you're a Han Solo like character where you owe a lot of money to these guys, and your harebrained scheme with your partner. Um, I also was influenced by a lot of Cowboy Bebop and stuff like that, where you kind of have, sort of a partner in crime. And so you and your partner would go off and um, you had this harebrained scheme where you're like, hey, I took all the money we had and I sunk it into this salvage vessel with all these drones. We're gonna go into like basically the Bermuda Triangle of space and just loot things off of ships and stuff like that. And your partner would be like, "This is the stupidest idea ever," and there would hilarity would ensue. And so I was going along with that for a little while, and the game started changing a little bit. We removed tower defense elements out of it, and it became much more about scavenging and searching. Um, and while the Han Solo storyline was fun, and I thought it was kind of campy, one of the problems with it was um, so I took some writing classes back in the day and some screenwriting classes, and one of the things that always struck me was this whole notion of always rowing in the same direction and building these tent poles and and that determining everything, and that's kind of making everything in a line, if you will. And so um, what happened was I was on a plane ride with uh, James Crawford, actually, and he started talking to me about the storyline idea that he had for Duskers, and it was that he's like, he was talking about kind of the zombie apocalypse, but in space. And immediately when he said zombies, my eyes rolled like this. Um, because there's so many zombie things that have been done. But one of the things that really struck me about the idea was the fact that there had been some apocalypse, and now don't get me wrong, a ton of video games have way too many post-apocalyptic storylines. But it put a lot more stakes on the game. Like rather than being like, oh, these mobsters are going to break my legs, it was like it was like, hey, something's really gone terribly wrong here. And it also motivates that whole derelict spaceship thing. Like, rather than it just be like, oh, this is just the Bermuda Triangle of space, it was, this is everything, and everyone is dead, and you're trying to find what happened. And that was incredibly compelling to me. And in storytelling, I know it's kind of a cheap device to, start a story off with a gun to somebody's head or something like that. And so I recognize that, like, oh, everyone is dead and the universe is a graveyard and stuff like that starts to feel melodramatic, unless we earn that. But it just felt like if I was making a game about exploring derelict spaceships, that would make a lot more sense if there was no choice but to explore derelict spaceships. And if you didn't, and if you failed, then you would die. You would starve to death or something like that. And suddenly, everything seemed much more in a line to me. You could go either way, and I know that Alex Austin kind of wants me to still go with the Han Solo thing, but it just seems more in line with, going through derelict spaceships to have these really high stakes. So as soon as I did that, I came up with a bunch of ideas. And actually, rather than reiterating everything, I will play you guys the first minute or so of the pitch video to give you an idea of one of my first ideas around what if it was a dead civilization and stuff like that. So here, let me see. Let me hope that hopefully the audio works with this. Let me get to atmosphere, if I can. Isolation, being surrounded by old. Oh, there we go. When I created Duskers, it was around a feeling of being alone in the dark, of isolation, of being surrounded by old gritty tech that could only give you a partial picture about what's going on around you, like the motion sensor that goes off but doesn't tell you exactly what's out there. I like the idea of needing to rely on that tech, and the claustrophobia and isolation that would cause. At the beginning of the game, you discover that the universe is a giant graveyard, and you have no idea what happened, or if there are any other survivors out there. I love the idea of piloting drones into derelict spaceships to tell that story, searching for supplies and an answer to the question of what happened. To answer that question, you'll download the captain's logs of each ship. Many will be corrupted, so some may be from their final moments and others from months before. You'll discover there's another survivor out there who's overwriting ship logs to communicate with you, like a pen pal on the other side of the universe. He writes about trying to cope with being alone. His anger, frustration, and fear will begin to come across as he writes more logs and becomes more intimate with you. This serves as your lifeline to humanity, in stark contrast to your sterile environment and isolation. Right, so, coming back to me, look at my crazy video editing. Or live stream editing on the fly. Anyway, so that kind of gives a quick idea of what I was trying to go for, right? It kind of gives this notion of isolation, and now it's really starting to mix Alien with the road. Alien being the gameplay, if you guys have seen the gameplay of the game, it's a lot like that with its plotting and motion sensors, and you don't know exactly what's going on, and that's what's the fun of that. And then the road being that you've got to kind of keep surviving, and the game keeps getting darker. And so my wife would probably make fun of me because a lot of times when I write, things get very dark very quickly. Even in A Virus Named Tom, where the game is very humorous and whimsical, there's a lot of very dark cutscenes and just dark humor in general. But so I try not to get too dramatic and too dark, but in a game where you're exploring derelict spaceships, it's just kind of like the way to go, I feel. So that was sort of my initial thought. That was like, hey, let's do that. And that seemed like it was really cool. And I came up with 4 different quick ideas to justify the roguelike nature of the game. So you don't have to justify the roguelike nature of your game. You can just be like, hey, I play like FTL, and then I lost, and now I'm going to reset. And the player knows in his mind that he's just starting over again. It's just a reset, and that's fine. But I always feel like I want to make my job difficult and be a pain in my own ass. So I decided that what if I could try to justify the roguelike nature of the game, and how would I do that? Like, how can I justify that you reset, right? And we're talking science fiction here, so we have some liberties that we can probably take. So I came up with a couple ideas. Let me see what I came up with. Let's move down here a little bit so I can remind myself. So one of them, which was kind of some of these are the front door and some of these are the side door. Some of these are going to seem a little bit hokey, but when you're brainstorming, just let yourself go. One of them was is that you were kind of a little bit crazy because you had been alone for so long, and so when you piloted around and you were finding these logs left by this other guy that you relate a lot to, that was you on previous missions, and just every now and then you would forget where you were, and that's like when you don't die in the game. That's something really interesting. You just simply have drones, and you run out of enough rations to continue to explore. So you never actually see yourself die. So it might be that you simply, you know, blacked out and forgot about things and then woke up. Or, you know, you're in this weird mental state. But it does seem like when you're writing, it does seem like a little bit of a cop out to do that. Oh, I'm in a dream or I'm crazy thing, right? It's a little too easy, and it doesn't feel clever. So then I started thinking about other things that we could do. One thing that was actually suggested to me is because you never see yourself and you're remotely piloting all these drones and these ships. It's like, what if you were remotely logging in from some location somewhere in the middle of the galaxy? And what if you didn't even know where you were? And you were actually trying to find yourself? And I thought that was really cool because, you know, remotely logging into a computer and stuff like that, like it's just such a cool justification as to why you could restart every time because you never died. You just, you know, the ship ran out of resources, and so then you're like, all right, hold on, let me log out and let me try and find another ship to log into. That seems kind of cool, but the problem with that, the stakes can be high because, you know, you could be dying or you're going to run out of food yourself. But I kept thinking, and I was like, what if the world was ending? What if there was some kind of calamity that nobody really understood, or like a culmination of calamities, and all of a sudden everybody was rushing at the end. And let's say they were really close to creating AI, but there were all these restrictions on it because people were really worried, and so, you know, you had to follow all these procedures. And so these scientists were like, all right, we're only like, you know, weeks or months away from our demise. Screw all the safeties. They're all out the door. We are just going to go gangbusters and try and create this AI. And the reason that they would do it is because, in theory, it could survive this apocalypse, which might be organic or might be something. It could download its consciousness into the cloud, and then bring itself into ships and pilot them. And it would be given the mission, A, find any survivors, and B, find out what happened and try to either fix it or make it so that the survivors don't have to deal with it so that humanity can go on. And this would be something that you would reveal over time, that, like, this is why you reset the game, is because you are simply uploading yourself and then re-downloading yourself, which would make sense why you would still know things, as the player would still know things from turn to turn or run to run. So that sounded kind of interesting. Again, the stakes, it would be interesting to deal with the whole humanity of being an artificial intelligence that isn't quite human but's trying to save humans, and like how that would be perceived and stuff like that. There are a lot of interesting questions there. And then the fourth one that I came up with was simply that the player at the end of their run would simply enter cryosleep and fire themselves off in a random direction that maybe the player could actually pick, and then hoping that, you know, like Ripley in Alien, that you would get picked up somewhere in space and somewhere in time and be revived and stuff like that. So all that stuff seemed like it was cool ideas, and I was like, maybe I could mix all of those things together. Maybe that would be interesting for people. And then what I did, and let me make sure that I'm not... and if anybody has any questions at any point, you can feel free to drop them in the chat. So then at that point, I was thinking about it, and I guess one of the things that was really difficult was justifying the reset, and then like what would be the possible end to this thing, like, and where was I? What was I from? And these are questions that are really interesting for the player, and for the writer, they have to figure them out. And you don't completely have to figure them out. Don't get me wrong. You can leave a lot of things hanging, but I also felt like I was missing some kind of connection. I was missing some kind of stake, some kind of reason, other than survival, which is a big one, but, you know, it might seem pointless. And that's when I came up with this new notion of these scientists. And I was like, very much inspired by 12 Monkeys and source code and stuff like that, except kind of in reverse. So what if we found some kind of singularity or some kind of anomaly, space magic, that allowed us to see a point in the future. Um, and we saw that everyone was dead. There was no life left. Um, and at that point, we're like, all right, let's try to send probes through, and possibly people through, to try and figure out what went wrong so that we could piece together our demise and avoid it. And so you are one of those people that got sent through. Um, and what would be really cool is if when you got sent through, they had no other means of contacting you, other than leaving sort of notes right now in the present, and those you would find in the future. And so, like on communication relays or something like that, there would be some special archive that you could log into and receive these messages. And one of the things that I really like about this is that it gives you this strong sense of purpose. You still feel isolated, but I also can have this tether with which I can talk to the player about things, and it's another storyline that might be interesting. For example, it could be that one of these scientists is is like a spouse or something very close to you, and over time they start talking more and more about how the project is losing funding because people don't believe in it anymore, or religious fundamentalists are bombing it, or there's war or economic strife going on, and it's like, yeah, that's 50 or 100 years in the future through this anomaly nobody believes in anymore, or it's just fallen out of favor. People forget after a year or two, and so that person is struggling to keep this project alive and keep this link with you there, and you're feeling kind of abandoned. I think that this is kind of a double-edged sword. I use that analogy a lot, but the good news about this is that one would be that you suddenly have this connection to someone that cares about you, and that might create these higher stakes and this kind of more interesting plot line. The bad thing about this is that it removes an element of your isolation because there's someone to communicate with, and we could make it so that we could start taking away that communication, or making that communication more tension in that communication. So there's things to play with here, but it does remove that pure element of I am absolutely alone. I am out in this universe, and that's a strong thing. So trying to resolve that in some kind of way is interesting. I'm talking about the story in Duskers right now. No worries. So basically, why don't I why don't I open it up, so that now if you guys have questions or whatnot, you could ask me about it. There's a long way to go. One of the things that while I'm talking about the gameplay a little bit, like one of the things I definitely want to do is integrate the story into the gameplay and leave the gameplay as king. Like the gameplay, everything is serving the gameplay. So I don't want to interfere with that. However, you're going to find these logs, and I feel for your short-term goal is just let's survive a ship, and that's the core gameplay. And then your long-term or midterm goal might be like, hey, I want to find out what's going on, and then your long-term goal might be these things that we set up, and these things might be, hey, we've got a theory, and maybe it's this. We found this reference to a disease. Maybe that's what happened, and so now all of a sudden you're like, how do I find out about this disease? And I don't want to make the game linear, because it's procedurally generated, so I don't want it to be that you go from point A to point B to point C. So the storyline has to be told in such a way that it could be random. You could find things in random order and maybe have to piece them together. I also really want to work with like corrupted files, because everything in the game is about things breaking and about being glitchy and stuff like that. I want it to be that a lot of the logs are corrupted, and that maybe there's a bulletin and it's very corrupted and you can only read a couple lines, but if you go to other outposts, you can find that same bulletin, and maybe different areas will be corrupted, and so maybe you can, flip through a couple of them and get the whole picture, which I think would be really cool. I also want it to be that the objectives aren't exactly like, go to point A and then go to point B and then go to point C. It would be really cool, for example, if it was like, hey, you need to find, I don't know, we think it was a war that broke out, and so you need to go find a military vessel and try to find logs that might pertain to what happened. And so then instead of like trying to go to point A, you're just looking around for military vessels, which we could plant all over the place. And so it's not like this linear path. and you're starting to piece these things together. And so that I think that's important. Is that keeping the game roguelike, keeping the game procedural, and making it so that the story isn't linear. However, I do feel that a crafted story can be really fun. I totally agree that if you play like SimCity or something like that, like you can create the story in your mind, and that's a lot of fun. However, I love being a storyteller, and I love reading stories that were crafted by someone. And so I think that that could be a lot of fun too. And maybe we can combine those things, and maybe we can find a way to keep it replayable and stuff like that. Because I do intend to have you reset not only where you are in the world, but then resetting the universe. But keeping the knowledge that you had and having that work in your favor, but kind of like this weird Majora's Mask kind of thing, if that makes any sense. so, um, yeah, I will post this to YouTube so that you can hear the whole spiel. I guess this isn't. I guess sometimes on Twitch it's better to do things that are more like people can jump in really easily to the conversation. But yeah, so that's kind of the idea. So now I will chat with you guys a little bit. Um, how about a story that's different for decisions you make? Like if you believe there was a zombie apocalypse, there was a zombie apocalypse. Um, No, that kind of makes sense. I do think that, like in a lot of these games, you would love your decisions to matter, right? You would love it to be that you're not on this constant arc, and I think that's kind of like um, Alex was saying earlier about XCOM, where there is a storyline, you are kind of moving it forward, but at the same point in time, you don't feel incredibly constrained. The story is sort of how you go about dealing with this threat, um, and that can be fun. So the only problem with that, of course, is the whole like narrative explosion that can happen, right? And so I'm hoping that what we can like like oh you can make all these different decisions and then we've got this exponential growth of all of these eventualities. So what I'm hoping to do right now is have one idea that I have in my brain on how we can kind of conquer this is imagine if I we come up with a bunch of different ways that the universe that shit might have gone really bad, and then um, when you start the game, we pick randomly a couple of those and start throwing seeds to that in, and you're finding them in random order. So even though we're trying to tell some kind of overarching story, the order in which you find things and the ones in which you find are different. So you would have a different experience than your friend, even though like after you've played the game a million times, you kind of have read all the same logs and like it kind of comes into a sharper focus. But maybe the first time that you play through, like you get three seeded things that another player didn't get, and maybe you see more than one at a time, and the order that you can attack them is totally different. And you might switch the order you attack them. Like let's say you've got two things that you're following up. You're like one of them is that there's a disease, and one of them is that there was some war, and did one of these happen and was one of these responsible? And maybe you happen upon a military vessel, and so you're like, oh, let me explore that avenue. And then later on you come across a research facility and you're like, well, let me explore that avenue a little bit. And you're kind of trying to piece together this mystery and attacking multiple threads at a time, if that makes any sense. Um, yeah, I think it makes sense in in my mind. The question is, can I do it? And can I make it compelling? Um, and then you get to some of my latest thinking. So I've been actually, what's really fun about this for me anyway, um, yeah, I'm trying to bump up the replayability. I'm trying to make it so that it's not just like you go through and then you finish, and then we have this procedurally generated game that you're like, I've already, like, you're just going to rehash the same story. I'm going to watch the same cutscene. I don't want that. So that's why I could hold off if I had these different points. If I could, each time you restarted the game, I could do different ones. It's a little bit more writing, but I love the idea that someone might start the game and be talking to their friend, and they're like, "Oh man, it looks like it was totally a war," and someone else would be like, "No, no, no, it's totally that the Patriots didn't win the Super Bowl, which just threw the world off axis." So, um, yeah. So another thing that has been really fun is I've started to, because I'm kind of a sci-fi nerd, and I don't always have an excuse to be a sci-fi nerd. So I've been researching a little bit more about different ways that the world might come to an end, which is kind of fun because there's a lot of theories out there that says that's going to happen, and it might not be too long from now. You've got your classic nanotechnology, you've got your artificial intelligence, you've got all sorts of fun ways. Actually, let me show you guys a really cool blog that I've been reading lately. You guys might get a kick out of. Let me see if I can. Where did I put that? Hold on. Hold, please. It is. Here it is. Okay, so. Okay, so the blog is called Wait But Why. Oh wait, you guys can't see this. There you go. And in it, there are two really interesting things. One of them is he starts talking about AI, and the fact that AI like can be exponential growth, and that as soon as we hit AI, we'll hit super AI, and that will be intelligence that's a lot smarter than mankind, and that will be and if that's self-teaching. Just like how we've made more progress in the last, 50 years than we have in the last, 150 years, things will, keep growing. And if it can teach itself, it's this kind of law of advanced returns, where if you're intelligent, then you can teach yourself more efficiently and become more intelligent. So it's kind of, instead of being linear, it's exponential. And so the idea is that that's sort of how progress is, and that things get kind of crazy pretty fast. And that's really interesting, because then all of a sudden you start thinking about, like, if there was an incredibly smart AI that was so smart that it became godlike. And this is a really kind of a cool picture that I enjoy anyway, where it's talking about AI intelligence, and right now, it's a little bit smarter than an ant, and we all look at it like, oh, haha, that's adorable, funny robot can do monkey tricks, and then all of a sudden it's like, the fuck? Because it just explodes right past us. So that's really interesting. And then in part two, he starts talking about all the ways that the sides that scientists kind of take on whether or not this is a great analogy too. It's like, we're sitting there at human level intelligence, and we're watching this intelligence come, and then it whizzes right by us, and then we're like, oh wait, that's way smarter than us now. And then there's this whole what side are the scientists on? Like, where do they think, optimistic or pessimistic, this will be? And it's really interesting stuff. All the horrible things that a robot could possibly do, and all the really great things that a robot or that artificial intelligence could possibly do. And you're just watching text whiz by right now. So that's really interesting. It is scary. It's a very scary article about, because just the idea that, like, who's gonna make the AI first, right? Is it gonna be someone who's rushing, or is it gonna be someone who's taking their time and thinking things through? And then once we have it, can we keep it in the box? Like, can we just be like, oh, we're not connecting you to any network, and will it become intelligent enough that it hides and is able to escape? And they talk about social engineering and how it could trick people and lie to people, and they also talk about morality. This is something that might be very intelligent, but didn't evolve where empathy or any of these qualities mattered, because they mattered for us for evolution. If the whole, like, Darwin and theory of evolution and stuff like that, like, it's like a lot of these traits that came about with us were so that we could be in packs and stuff like that, and that wouldn't be present in an AI. So it might be that, and they talk a little bit about how we anthropomorphize a lot of AI, make it either really scary or really make it evil or good, and the result would probably be that it would be ambivalent about a lot of things that we think are really important. And that's why it's scary, is because it might be like, oh hey, like, you know what, like, to be the most efficient at my goal, it could be that, like, killing people is a good thing. Why not? So that's kind of fun to read about, because also the explosion makes it that I could make Duskers not set in the far-flung future. It could just be like, 50 years from now, and things could be completely different, because once we discovered that AI and it went super AI, then all of a sudden, like, all these advances in technology would happen in a rapid progression, like over, just a year or two. So that's one thing. Um, yeah, now put it in Duskers, and that's the thing is that not to give anything away or anything like that, but like it could be that like these other things that you're looking for are kind of a red herring. It's kind of like if we died, if we went extinct, and then all of a sudden someone from the past came to the future and was like trying to read headlines, and they were like, oh, like some kids weren't immunized, like maybe that destroyed them all, like like how you'd be following all these things that weren't really it, and this is inspired by 12 Monkeys and stuff like that. And now, to just take it to another level, there's the Fermi paradox, if I'm pronouncing that correct, which is basically talking about. Here, let me show you. It's basically talking about the fact that why haven't we discovered life, right? Like, why in all of these stars, with all these possible habited planets, haven't we discovered life? And the idea is that the life of the solar system is so long that basically it's the odds that someone if life came just before us or just after us, they would have such a head start, right? And the odds that we're the first is pretty low. So there are these theories with this great where there's this filter that kind of kills off a lot of intelligence, and it's like, are we past that and other things aren't past that, or are we heading toward that? But my favorite thing is all the theories behind this. There are various explanations of things, but one of them is, are there logical reasons why we might not have heard from uh, alien life? And so one of those, they have all these different theories. One of them is really fun that I kind of like, which they talk about a super predator. Um, Here, let me see if I can find it. Okay, probability 5. There's only one instance of higher intelligence life, a super predator. Civilizations like humans are here on Earth, far more advanced than anyone else, that keeps it that way by exterminating intelligent civilizations when they get past a certain level. This is super fun. This is basically, if you've played Mass Effect, and I don't want to give anything away, but your fingers in your ears if you haven't. But if you've played Mass Effect, this is basically the theory, is that there is, because an advanced civilization would become so much more advanced so quickly, and it's exponential, they'd be way ahead of everybody else. And then, in theory, they could be like, oh, these guys are getting more advanced, let's just squash them. So that's a really interesting theory. There's also other really cool things, like we're listening to the wrong things, and the zoo hypothesis, where they're actually observing us and stuff like that. So these are all other ways that I could make this stuff happen. And what's really fun for me is that like one of the game constraints was at the beginning was I didn't want to put a ton of bodies in all of these spaceships. I not only did I not want to populate them, but because it's a roguelike and you'd go through like in like hundreds or thousands of spaceships when you're playing, I didn't want you to see repeats of like someone slumped over or whatever. I'm also an independent game developer, and I know that I need to draw a line somewhere and not have a ton of art. Um, Even though I could just make Brendan make lots and lots of art. But then he would want me to pay him for that. So it's like, you got to put constraints on things. And that was sort of one of them. I was like, if I can make it that I don't have to populate this world with all these bodies, also it's creepier to not have any bodies in there. So one of the things we did, if you look at the new art style, is we've made things that you're reading data, and like you're seeing data rather than a camera shot, and so you could interpret some of these things as bodies, and it's very kind of Rorschachian, if that's a word, and I like that. But I also wanted to come up with a possibility of a way that life became extinct that it wouldn't have left all these bodies. And when you really start to get into theoretical science, you can come up with all these crazy things that are way bigger than a disease. I was thinking at first, I was like, oh, there's this weird phenomenon in space that just, kind of does this thing, and it only affects organic material or something like that. But you can start to think of all these crazy things if we invented, I know that nanotech is kind of like an easy hammer for the nail that is something went wrong. Um, but things like that, or just the fact that you have this super intelligence that could easily, start manipulating matter or something like that, on these scales that we could never kind of comprehend. If there was something so intelligent that, as we are to ants, it is to us, then it wouldn't, even if morality came in, like, we don't usually feel too guilty if we're putting a subdivision in and we tear up some anthills. Um, so it might not feel guilty, and it might know of a very efficient way um, of getting rid of us. uh, right. Yeah. Someone else had the idea that, like, yeah, so it could be that you then, at the end of the game, stumble upon this AI or this alien super predator or whatever it is. And we can go as dark or as not dark as we want to go. Like, we could, make it very dark, or we could make it all, a little bit happier, where it's like, it was in a formative year when it just, or formative time when it destroyed sort of its creator without really thinking too much about it, and it sees value in not destroying, and so somehow it can help you fix that, or maybe it's completely ambivalent and it doesn't care at all. Running into that at the end would be really cool, but difficult. So, but yeah. So a lot of inspiration drawn from like 12 Monkeys, Source Code, Alien, The Road. Um, there's a short story by Greg Bear called Blood Music that's absolutely awesome, and it really starts to underscore how quickly things could change and how foreign that intelligence could be, even if we create it. And that one's a little bit more biological, but it's great if you have a chance to read that. Um, but yeah, so it's really fun looking into a lot of this theoretical science stuff and figuring out all sorts of crazy ways that things could go horribly wrong.